So, good morning, everyone here at MEG. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for those joining us online for the second day of this conference, Decolonizing Provenance Research Experiences in Co-constructing Knowledge and Negotiating the Future of Colonial Collection. We're very happy today to have with us Brook, who's actually the only speaker who could make it live to the conference. And he had to leave Australia months ago to be able to travel and to be here with us. We're very happy. We're especially happy because Brook has been collaborating with us in the past in an exhibition and today is going to talk about an issue that concerns us because we have in our collection some very particular items he's going to talk about. And so today, Brook is going to be in conversation with some of his colleagues in Australia, Andrew Bryan, Martin, Roslyn, McGregor, and Kimberley, Moulton. So I won't say more and give you the floor, Brook. And I think this is your microphone.
Merci beaucoup. And yama, everyone, it means hello in Wiradjuri, my mother's language. And Ngadi Wiradjuri Kalamide and Celtic and Bandung for this invitation, and to Boris, to all of you, all my familiar friends here, and of course the technical team. Thank you for being really fantastic in these difficult times, and I'm really pleased to be here. And so this is the PowerPoint, but maybe if we could bring up the other, if we could bring up Arnie, Ros, Brian, and Kimberley, if they've all logged in now. It'd be lovely to see their faces. There's Brian, Kimberley, and hopefully Anu Ros is there somewhere. I also wanted to acknowledge the Gamilaroi mob out there in Colonial. I know that they're in the adjacent room to Arnie Ros, who's one of the senior elders out there on Gamilaroi country, and they're very excited. This is a very important time for that community. I've been working with Arnie Ros for some years now, which I'll explain a little bit in a minute. And hopefully we'll see Arnie Ros very soon. But how we're going to run this today is I'll just show a quick PowerPoint presentation to give some context. Thank you. So guulany is tree in Wiradjuri. Of course, we have many other names for trees. If we could have the next slide, please. The next slide, please. So when the next slide comes up, there we go. I'm sure a lot of you here have seen this map of Australia. It's not perfectly exact in regards to boundaries and the way we see them, but it's a really great representation. So Kimberley is Yorta and Wiradjuri, and Brian is Gamilaroi, Bunjalung, and also Marawani. And our countries connect. So on the right, on the, where is it? Southeast, there's a very large country there, that's Wiradjuri. And then then there's Gamilaroi and Yorta. So there is a really important relationship to us, and especially in regards to the guulany or the tree. If you could have the next slide, please. I thought it was very important to give some context. This is a smoking ceremony that we work with Arnie Ros and the Gamilaroi community out there with the kids. And this was in the context of when I curated the Nidden, which means edge, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney in 2020. We went out there to ask the permission of Arnie Ros and her community to use a very specific film called the Balfour footage, which is a 1949 film footage. Could we have the next slide, please? This was a very difficult time for Aboriginal people around this area, because it was when many trees were taken in 1949. Of course, there are other stories about other trees taken. So we asked Aunty Ros and the community if we could have permission to show this, actually at the Biennale. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a view of the Biennale. There's many different artists represented here. You have Eric Bridgman, who's a Papua New Guinean artist, Australian Papua New Guinean artist, with the large painted wall up the back. And you've got Stomaka, who's an artist, a Tongan artist, who has the work at the front, the tapa cloth. And you'll see that there's the video work on the left-hand side there of the Balfour footage. There's also an historical painting, which is from Frederick McCubbin on the back wall, which is an early colonial scene. And it was very important that I worked with communities in regards to these, I suppose, evidence or things that were lost in history or weren't seen as important, but I called them powerful objects. So, for example, the colonial painting and the Balfour footage, for me, are powerful objects. And as mentioned, I work with the community to get permission to show this, and it was a very important process, hence the smoking ceremony. So it's a very important part of healing for our communities, because there are very few guulany left in the district. Can we have the next slide, please? This here is a view, of course, here of two guulany, and as Boris said, I've had a long relationship with them, and at the moment it's a very important way to move forward in regards to repatriation and restitution, and of course the decolonial project, which is happening here at MEG, which is very specific and it's very empowering. And just one more slide, please. So this really introduces the next film. So we'll be showing two films. One is about 13 minutes, which Aunty Ros organised with her community, and really speaks from country, the importance of what the guulany are here, and also the guulany that there are a few existing still on site, on country. And then we'll be seeing a short film from both Brian and Kimberley that really introduces themselves, and also the connection between the two stories and the research project that we have, and of course the deep connection that we have with Meg. So just to recap, we'll be just showing the next two films, and then we'll be going to a group conversation with Kimberley, Aunty Ros and Brian. And could we have the first film, please?
We listen carefully to country as we walk softly on this land. Here today, we speak to country. Not to each other, not now. We listen to country. Today we show respect and walk in awareness of the trees behind us, the carved, the sacred things, the Bora ground, and the ancestors that connected them all. They tell us of those who are sacred, those that are not here today, those that were taken.
Yama Malia Birligal Gobiai. Kimberley Nale. Ngaya Google down Murray winning Ailana. Yeni nya ubala ngaya ngulay winning Ailana. Tulu board Google Bora winning Ailana. Down go Maru winning Goldai. Bulawa Bula Yanawan die. Ngulay yeni down da Garru. Gawaltana Gamubala Gawal Leyland die. Dulu yini winning Ailana Wandago Namagarl die. Bo down de gani ila de bala.
I thought they were called the carved trees.
They are the carved trees. So these carved trees have been around here for a long time. Some of these trees are over 800 years old when they're that big and they've been growing out there in the bush. But they're from a bora ground, and a bora ground is where you, when you grow up and you become a man, you learn all this stuff about the trees, okay? And you learn about the patterns that are on them. We've lost a little bit of it, but there are glimpses from people that do know information about these trees. So it's very important. When you get old enough that you keep coming back into these trees, they're like our libraries. They'll be telling us exactly who came before us and what they mean for you in the future, what you've got to protect and where you come from.
There's lots.
There's lots of them, isn't there? Yes. So there was over 100 trees that they'd taken from the bora ground. These are the ones that are just left around here. Yeah, and these were just down at the old homestead just down the road, and they've propped them up in here. It looks good, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Looks tidy. It's protected from the weather.
I see today as a really important day in allowing our kids to understand what culture is to them, linking that to education so that they have a really great understanding moving forward. Because if we don't tell these stories and get these stories into the minds of our students now and our kids now, they'll be lost forever.
The biggest impact I've seen from the carved trees is from 10, 11 years ago from children. It was just, oh, I've heard of the carved trees, to now it's integrated into our programs. Kids use their artwork based on those stories from the carved trees, those markings, the connection to country.
I teach local lessons, which is very important for the revitalisation of the local Kimberley language. Language lessons are very critical for an Aboriginal student as it gives them self-esteem, identity, culture and pride. They become interested and participate more in class, which enables them on their educational journey. Sacred trees hold many of our ancestors' stories. They connect us to our identity, language, culture and heritage, and most importantly, connection to country. It is hoped that one day all those trees that belong to Kimberley country, especially those that were taken from colonial, be returned to their people, returned to their land. Giving back those trees gives back our history, identity and a cultural education opportunity for the younger generation. Gaan Galia, Nininu Dulu, bring back our trees. Thank you.
Some of them young adults now, so I've been working with them since they were in kindy, and really watching them has been a really amazing privilege as they create new and contemporary ways of expressing their culture, and their connection to the Banawe Bora ground and the carved trees, watching them embrace that and bring it into a new understanding is really, I could not have imagined coming up here to do an arts project that the reverberation that's had. And the fact that these trees might actually come home, back to country, it's just, I can't express how how amazing that is to be just even the smallest part of that journey, and the generosity of this community.
Ros came to me with an opportunity to collaborate with Colorado Central School with such a significant thing for young Kimberley people, whether that be at Collie or whether that be at Walgett, it really was just a unique opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity.
What we wanted to do, what the students wanted to do, is try and get as close as they could in the modern day to the carving of the trees. So we basically looked at the students painting all these beautiful murals, and we put them onto the black wood, and it was just a fantastic way to have the students paint and create and use their skills in trying to make a really positive and good connection to their past.
I am Shayani and I'm in Year 7. It was great to go on Kimberley country and see the carved trees. I've got some ideas from the carvings to put in my artwork. I'm young and still have lots to learn about the history of carved trees, but now I know it's time for them to come home.
We just had the privilege of having such a good experience with Ros and Liz, and taking the opportunity to get up to Coloranabri and be on country with the Stage 4 students, which really was the impetus of this exhibition. So, you know, when we look at phenomenology and we look at First Nations people, they're responding to their experience and the experience of being on country, where they really understood the symbols that were actually carved into the trees. And when they came back, we had a series of workshops. And these workshops, where each stage group will come in and just respond to the experience of being on the land and creating the symbols that meant something to them and put them into a series of designs.
The students could recognise what the significance to them in their journey as young people, and that legacy that will be left up to them by the people who started this journey. From a cultural standpoint, what other better opportunity would these students be able to get? And it's the words of Ros McGregor that these students need a Western education, but not at the expense of their culture and identity.
From seeing the carved trees in the Powerhouse Museum 15 years ago on a school excursion to now that I'm working at the school, being in the thick of things like going out on country and learning from elders, the kids and I really soaked in the knowledge and got an understanding on how important that the carved trees are coming back home. Seeing the film in 2020 of the trees getting cut down and stolen was a very disturbing sight to see. I was in complete shock when I seen that happening, and I wondered if they're ever going to be returned back to its home soil.
And we're working through the process now of trying to get them back. So some of those learning institutions like Melbourne Museum, over in Adelaide, I think we've had delegations from Coloranabri go there to have a look at them, and I've been down to Melbourne and I've been very upset by the fact that some of these trees aren't displayed. They are put in a shed, a storage shed, and they're strapped down to a pallet, and it made me cry. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the more power that traditional owners have to try to get them back to country is important. Once we get these back, I think it'll complete the circle for those trees with their travel and what they've done, but also for our community here to start rekindling some learning experiences for them about what the trees mean.
Don't you try? They've been carved by our people, you know? Yeah, they're very important to us. We just want them back. They're ours. We want them back. It's us, they've been stolen. That's why we want them all brought back. Yeah, we're going to put them on the road from the cemetery gate up to our Aboriginal cemetery. I won't probably be around to see that, but I hope my grannies are.
We don't know when those trees will be returned. It's up to you young people. If you're in kindergarten, maybe that's your job in 50 years' time, to bring those trees that are in museums, not only here in Australia, but around the world, home, to rightfully where they belong. Thank you.
Yama Malia. I am Chris Bard, standing here along with our colonial border trees on behalf of my families and school. Today is one of those amazing days in Collie where we get to celebrate our past with our present and take that into our future identities and heritage.
My name is Annabelle Cole, and on behalf of our emerging elders, I say that the beauty of our trees is known around the world, but the importance they bring to our identity is more than we understand. I know that one day my sister and brothers, cousins and friends will have to take care of these trees. We will also have to tell people about the history. Can you help us to learn how to do this?
Our generation cannot do it alone. We need the past. That is why we are here. We never walk alone. And as these trees show, those who joined to create them hundreds of years ago are the reason we are here today.
The Gamilaroi people gained strength from the knowledge of past of our carved trees and from one another. But as we gather, we know there is some spirit missing. We know there is something missing every time we come here. They were created together. Their meaning has strength together. But they know a part of them is missing. When the others start coming home, coming back, the carved tree's spirit will return to the full strength of their purpose. We know that purpose may not be as it was, but it allows us to evolve just like us. We look forward to our carved trees coming home, on country, on Gamilaroi country.
Nyeninginda ganuga gagawea. Gamilaroi marumali, nyeni bula marumalabli. Benau biruli mari, wandanile, yanagilawaya. Yaliunga bala, winning ailandai.
Thank you for that. Could we just jump into the second video, please?
So we're here today to talk about a project called More Than a Guulany, Aboriginal Knowledge Systems. And guulany is actually a Wiradjuri word for trees. And this is a project, an Australian Research Council project that's myself and Brook, Garru, Andrew are leading, and of course Kimberley is a researcher on the project as well. And what we're looking at specifically is the significance of trees, mainly in Southeast Australia, and that's why it's called, of course, More Than a Guulany, More Than a Tree, and how trees are our ancestors. And specifically when we think about marked trees, and I say marked trees specifically as opposed to scar trees, because we're trying to change the narrative of like a deficit or something negative. So mark trees as our cultural ancestors. And really the project looks at about the significance of trees in the narratives of culture and place, and how they interact, I suppose, between the past and also the present into the future. And in particular, this is why we're at Museums Victoria today, to talk about some of these guulany, or in Bunjalang, bungabi, talk about trees and their significance in context of the project as a whole.
So we're currently sitting in the storage facility for Museums Victoria, and within this storage facility we have around 22 cultural belongings of ancestors, or they're known as dendroglyphs as well, or carved trees, and they're actually behind us right now. As part of my role as Senior Curator for the Southeastern Collection, I care for and curate over 4,000 cultural belongings from across Victoria, New South Wales and also Tasmania. And these carved trees, or these cultural belongings, are a significant part of that collection. They came to the museum in around 1950 from an expedition between Museums Victoria and the South Australian Museum that went out onto country and cut down without permission the trees from country.
Yeah, and I think that the matrix of relations is so important, and Mary Graham talks about this, Dr. Mary Graham talks about this, Auntie Dr. Mary Graham talks about this in terms of, you know, place and how the matrix of relations is premised on place. So the relationality between people is important, and the relationality between people and place is important. And that matrix of relations is important because that's where agency comes from country. This is what these cultural materials and ancestors carry in, as opposed to seeing them as objects. They're not artefacts or objects. They are living entities. They carry that agency. And it's also, I think, one thing that's valuable when we think about Indigenous cultures in Australia is the rearticulation, or you use the term regeneration as well, which is amazing. I think that rearticulation of our practices from the past into the present is so important. So when we look at ritual, memory and practice, that's what's important about how, you know, some of these dendroglyphs, for example, that were painted, those paintings or even some of the carvings would have been redone and touched up. So it's almost like it goes against the idea of this Western concept of conservation, don't touch the authentic object in a way, whereas these cultural materials were supposed to be used, supposed to degenerate, they're supposed to fall apart, you know, and that's what's interesting, because these are organic materials, they will eventually disappear.
Yes.
But then our culture is, well, we make another one.
I think it's the building of relationships between the institutions and the community, like we've been speaking about, and it's an ongoing, I think, with repatriation as well. It's around, you know, really fostering that between communities and the institution, and it's an ongoing relationship, because, you know, these relationships have been held for hundreds of years in some cases, since our cultural belongings have gone into these institutions. And so how do we foster a healing in that space and a continued sort of positive relationship ongoing, where in some cases our, you know, cultural materials can be back on country, but also our culture and our histories can still continue to be represented in these spaces through the living voices of the community. Museums Victoria, we've worked on several repatriations, and we did repatriate a tree a few years ago back to community, and that was a momentous occasion for us because it was a part of a healing of that history, but we continue to have a relationship with that community through curatorial, through conservation, collection management, and it's just a really positive example of what can come from that kind of project and relationship building, really. But the cultural strengthening, I think, like you were talking about with the work that Auntie Ros is doing and that this project, you know, aims to work with community. I've witnessed myself working for many years, working with youth and collections, and the cultural strengthening that comes from kids and children having the opportunity to be with elders with these collections and cultural belongings. And it's really significant for identity and for grounding.
So I think what's so important about the re-articulation of cultural materials back into the next generation, into our youth, what's important, even sitting here with you, and I know what's behind us, you know, this is a connection back to country. This is so significant, and it's so grounding in place. I mean, we're not on Kimberley country here. No. You know, we're on Wurundjeri country in Victoria, and there's other country here, there's other place here. So it takes us back to place in those ways. And I think what's really important about that in the next generation is it's about showing the reactivation of culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that understanding the full story is so important, and obviously as researchers, you know, that's what we do, right? It's investigating history and it's getting that full story. And right now, you know, where we're sitting, there's just one part of the story here. Yeah. And it is distressing. It is quite distressing, you know, being and coming in here and seeing these ancestor trees, you know, off country. But I also, you know, think that in that work that we're doing in sort of looking at the agency of these ancestor belongings, the agency of the community that continue to connect to them, and also, you know, the relationship between the museum and this history, pulling it all together. Yeah, some of it's not pleasant, some of it's actually pretty ugly, but also we need to recognise that, acknowledge it, and you know, continue the journey, because it's stopped halfway here, I think. You know, there's time that the journey is, you know, still going, and yeah, we'll see where that takes us, but yeah, let's hope.
What are these materials? These are amazing.
Yeah, so in the process of exchange, when the Melbourne Museum or Museums Victoria received the trees, there was a letter that we received from Geneva asking for a carved tree for their collection. And so over the course of a little while, there was letters that were back and forth between Melbourne and Geneva discussing, well, what are we going to exchange, you know, what are you going to exchange us for this carved tree? And there were some other Aboriginal cultural materials that were sent over with that tree also. So
this was in the 1950s?
This is in the 1950s, yeah. And so what we're seeing here is the Peruvian pottery, the extremely significant pre-Columbian Peruvian pottery that was exchanged for the carved tree. So, you know, Geneva, you've got the tree from Melbourne Museum, which is from country, was never ours in the first place. But that exchange, and what we're seeing here is the Peruvian cultural material that was exchanged for that tree. It's really, I mean, it's breathtaking. There's incredible pieces in here that you can just get a sense of the culture and the people that use these, that painted their identity, their markings, you know, on their cultural material. And yeah, I guess when we were talking before around this, getting the full picture, this is starting to appear for us now, the more research and the more we go into this moment in history between Geneva and Melbourne. And it's coming to light. The objects and the cultural material are showing themselves to us.
Merci beaucoup. Maybe if Auntie Ros, Brian and Kimberley are in the internet ether, we can bring them up onto the screen, please. I just wanted to mention too that Simon Rose worked with Brian and Kimberley to create that last film. Yama.
Hi Brook. Hi Art. Hi Kim.
Hi. Hi, Auntie Ros. how's the reception there with everyone in the other room? Annie Ros, can you hear me?
It's good.
Yep, I think you're on silent. You're on. We can't hear you.
Where's the camera? Yeah, it's fine here.
That's great.
Great.
Fantastic. So we have like about 25 minutes to have this discussion, and I was just wondering, Annie Ros, maybe we could start with you, and maybe if you could share a bit about the healing power and that journey, and how important it is for all of you to, and for the kids, but also to think about repatriation.
I guess the point, and that was made in the video, the trees were stolen from a very special place here in New South Wales. And, and nations, came from all around to practice, our old ways, our culture. And to teach, our young to be adults. I guess that's the important message. And the trees were stolen, but they have never been forgotten. And they were made by our old people. They hold the spirit, of our ancestors. And Brian and Kimberley talk about that as well. They hold the spirit of our ancestors, and they need to come home, which is important, so our spirits can, be together. And I guess when I started this journey in my own community, Corinda, and more recently at Walgett, with the young people there and the colleagues, that I work with in Walgett, it's about educating our young people about the trees, and they have brought, the community, with them. And I honestly believe, our old people are guiding us, they're guiding us to be with you, Brook, Roslyn and Jessica. I honestly believe this because I sit back, here we are tonight, zooming in my community and in Walgett, we're live at this conference, and it could be only our old people guiding us.
I mean, I know that our colleagues and friends here sitting here in Geneva, you can't see them, but they're very proud and happy to have you all here joining us from Australia. And I suppose the most important thing in this context that you all talk about is that when these cultural important ceremonial objects were taken from us, it actually stops ceremony, and also people being on missions, genocide, the inability to speak our language, which is why some of those really important language knowledge holders were talking about the importance of language for us. And of course we had the mission system as well. So we had policies of segregation, which was the equivalent of apartheid, which happened in other parts of the world, and then we had assimilation. And if we kind of relate that to a European context, it's like you can't go to church or do ceremony anymore, you can't speak your language anymore. These are very big hurdles to come over, and I think that's why it's so important to have these relationships internationally, and why this project is, and why you talk about healing. And yeah, I mean, just in the context of what you're saying, Annie Ros, Brian, your own practice as an artist really focuses on trees as well. And I was just wondering if you could share something about healing, and then Kimberley, yourself as well, and we could maybe just talk together about these contexts and other contexts that come up.
Yeah, thank you, Brook. And also, I'd like to pay my respects to you, Annie Ros, of course, and being on country, on Kimberley country, and also pay respects to Wadawurrung country, where I'm located, but also to Bunjang, Wurruwarri, Kimberley countries, where my ancestry is from. And I think also, Brook, what you're saying and what Annie Ros has said, in terms of healing, it's a spiritual agency from place that these special trees and our ancestors. That's why in the video we refer to them as our ancestors, because they're not objects. And I think that's the difference is for us in Australia and in Aboriginal communities, country is a living subject, it's a living entity. One belongs to country, as opposed to this idea of one owns land. And it's that reciprocal relationship we have, and that's our connection. So when country is taken away, it's like you're taking away a relative, in a way. So it's that separation, and that's the healing process is about the return of our ancestors in a way to place. And that return could never be what it was, but nor should it, because that's part of history and that's part of Aboriginal culture in Australia. All cultures in general is about the perseverance and strength in the transformation of culture. Culture is always moving and changing. Country is always moving and changing. And that's the beautiful narrative about, while something might be seen so traumatic, in the removal and looking at that footage is always traumatic to see our ancestors cut down in that manner. But we don't repeat that process. We don't repeat that violence. We repeat it with a healing way and a healing narrative, which was done with respect and respecting our elders and respecting, like Auntie Ros has talked about, the old people who made those marks. We proceed with respect and honour, and that's what's healing and that's what's strengthening. Do you want me to keep talking?
No, sure, why not? Oh, Kimberley, you're working within the museum context as well. And you talked about really the trauma and how difficult it is, and we all get that from all sides, right? Regardless if we're in the ground and community, and I know you go back home a lot and travel around, or within our own practice, and that's a very difficult space to negotiate.
And I'd also just like to acknowledge Auntie Ros as well, Senior Elder, and I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country in what we now know as Melbourne. I go home all the time, Brook, back to my Yorta Yorta country, and we're talking about respect and ancestors and belonging, and our living culture and our elders and our community gives us that, but also our cultural material, our cultural belongings give us that sense of belonging and place and connection. And so when when I go into museums, I work for a museum, of course, with lots of cultural material from the 19th century onwards, but I've also done a lot of research in international museums to connect to those cultural belongings of both my ancestors, but also of the Southeast, and visit them. And I know that's the work you've been doing for many decades, and we all kind of work in this space of connecting and respect and honouring from and who we've come from. And I've written about these objects and seeing these objects, and I often get photos with these objects too when I go, especially internationally, to research and to connect to them, because it is like seeing a long lost family member. And when you meet your family for the first time, or that you haven't seen them in a really long time, you take photos and you connect, and that's sort of the practice that I have as well in working with collections, is that deep respect for connection.
Auntie Ros, being a senior elder and traditional owner, how have things shifted for you and your community? And because I know how difficult it is to really live on country and to empower country, but and it was so wonderful, of course, to hear again in the film. By the way, both of the films are so beautiful, and thank you all and all the mob you work with to really create these films, because they're very rare. But Auntie Ros, how important has it been for you and over the last 3 or 4 years? What are the kind of shifts that have been very empowering?
Well, I guess it's important, for our young people. You know, we do have a culture. You know, we do have a culture. I work in schools, and often you see, you know, particularly around art, you know, Western style. And fortunate enough to meet a Sydney-based artist, a non-Aboriginal person, Liz O'Reilly, and we started that journey. You know, we do have the carved trees, and it's about our young people, where, you know, the Nawe bore, and it was important that our young people know they were the very first lessons, you know, for our old people, and to make that connection as Aboriginal people because of culture. And when you saw that film, you know, young Carl, he would have been in primary school. That makes me proud that they can speak proud and know who they are, because, as I said, you know, our kids, they do need a Western education, but not at the expense of our cultural identity. And they are strong, young people, Aboriginal people, in our community, and we're learning it our way. And I guess, you know, it's always been in, you know, the communities. You know, we've never given up hope of having those trees return to country. And it's your visit in 2020, Brook, that rekindled that. And that's why we're here tonight or in the morning in Geneva. And it's once again those old spirits guiding us. How long that will take, I don't know, for those trees to return home. But one thing I'm sure of, and I speak, you know, for Walgett mob, Collie mob, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people who work and walk with us, we do plan on seeing our mob down at Monash and at, you know, the Victoria Museum. If they aren't repatriated, we need to be, you know, where the privileged, you know, Brian and Kimberley are. That is the next step we take from here after, you know, tonight. And there's a lot of mob out there and, you know, in Walgett that are watching this, and, you know, small step, but it means the world to us, you know. Yeah.
Inyamara, which means walking with life respectfully. I think we have a few questions. Are you all comfortable to listen to take a few questions maybe?
So we have a multiple question from on the web from Laurence Favre I think to all of us, to Megan, to you in Australia. So what is your opinion on the problematic of state versus communities regarding decision-making on repatriation? And I think that's one of the questions that actually is relevant to all contexts that we are reviewing these days. You know, how does the relationship work between communities and different levels of government, and how do you organize decision making? How do you convince multiple stakeholders for, on one side, for the demands, for the request for repatriation, and on our side, and the second part of the question, what is the autonomy of a museum like Meg in decision making regarding the possible return of stolen objects directly to the communities? So perhaps you answer first.
Yeah, I might quickly just respond to that. It's a massive question. It's a thesis, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who are looking at this right now. And I think that, you know, in reflection on that, I won't talk too much, but from my perspective as an artist and working with community and also with museums, it really depends on the kind of objective, the aim of the museum itself. I know that Meg has, you know, very recently started a very important decolonial process and methodology. And I'm very much looking forward to that, and other museums are too, but also communities back home working with museums. And I think maybe, Brian, Kimberley, Annie, Ros, if one of you would like to respond to that.
Well, I'm not quite sure how they will return home, but one thing we are quite sure of, how they were taken. And that would, to bring those trees home would rely on the support, the generosity, the goodwill of all people to return. We're an Aboriginal community. We don't have much. So that would require the goodwill of many to return. Whether government, non-government, I don't have the answer, but that's what it would require.
Also, if I can add, Brook, on to sorry, Tim, what
no, you go. You go
as well. I think that. Oh, sorry. I think the important thing is also that we understand how we know how things are taken, but it's also about the narrative now. And I think the idea of there's institutions want to decolonise themselves, but in that we got to look at decolonising. Eve Tuck talks about decolonising is not a metaphor. Well, I think decolonising can be seen as a metaphor, and we need action. I think that's what's really important about the next phase in repatriation. But I think it's also, we've all spoken about this, it's about the next narrative. So it's not like the institution loses out and is left with an empty case, that an object or a cultural material is given back to a community and it's left with something that's empty. It's left with an amazing narrative of that journey back to country. It becomes part of its journey, and I think that's what's exciting for everyone. It's about how do we do this through healing, and then we are a living culture. We can actually make something to put back in that museum. So we can we're practitioners. That's what we do. So there's a whole number of layers and levels to this, and it's a benefit to everyone, because what Arnie Ros is talking about, we can see in that, of course, in that beautiful video, younger generations on country get to experience this, and so there's multiple layers for everyone. It's basically a win for everyone in a way. There's no loss. It's about gain. It's about healing, and the narrative that gets replaced in the institution is quite a strong narrative, and there's an ownership of that narrative from the institution as well. And I think that's what decolonising is about. That's what institutions need to get behind and the charge of that. And that's what I know Kimberley talks about from Museums Victoria, is that's what they're of charge with, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, just to add to that, Brian, I think everything you've spoken about is, again, going back to relationships and repatriation. It doesn't end when the object is returned. What you get from repatriation is a whole new way of connecting and relationships. And, the case might be empty, so to speak, of that object, that ancestral belonging that may be going home. But what is, in return is relationships. And what can come from that is, new material, is lots of different ways to share culture, the living culture of our people, in international institutions or national institutions. So for Melbourne Museum, we are actively repatriating. We are actively repatriating cultural material, not just ancestral remains or sacred material, which we have been doing for decades and many museums have been doing for decades. So now is a time where we are building relationships with community, healing relationships with community, and we are open to repatriation. And I think it does come down, perhaps in the Australian context, around the institution and that museum being open and working with communities and state government to be able to repatriate. But it really comes down to the museum and that relationship with community.
Thank you. I might just quickly mention too, I met with Philip Green, the ambassador to Germany, Switzerland and Liechtenstein last week, and we were talking about this. So just to, in quick finishing off the question, I mean, I think that people are looking at it from a very source community to, us in between or around, and also at that high level of the Australian government and of course local governments. And I think that if we all work together, as Ani Ros says, with good faith, walking together, I think that that's the best outcome.
So I think I should answer on our side. So thank you very much for these actually heartwarming words, because in the museum community and in the whole point of our decolonial process is to really strive to re-establish equitable exchanges and relationships and long-term relationships with what we used to call the source communities, or at least the cultural bearers today, who are the stakeholders of our collections. So to answer the question that was put on the web and to follow suit on what Brook just said, so requests for restitution may come from the official, I can say, or diplomatic ways through ambassadors, and we have a number of cases open, including one with Australia about human remains, and that follows formal procedures. But one must know that we are a city museum. As a city museum, we have no, I think what you call it, legal personality. So we museum people, and I as a director, do not decide whether an item can be repatriated or not. It is our authority. Our authority is the city authority. Now, whatever requests can be addressed directly to the city authorities, and it is our job, the curatorial team and the director, to give an advice. And I'm entitled to say that our authority is very open to the issue of decolonizing the museum, the collections, and very open to the issues of restitution, and that they would welcome claims from any level, be it a state, be it a museum, be it a community. And requests can be addressed to the museum director, or to curatorial staff, and we forward it. And also I have to say that although I understand that when you're talking about, the vast, the large number of trees and ancestors who were taken, is going to take maybe a whole generation to have them back home. Processes need not be long or take a lot of time in museums like this one, and I can assure that we can, we would deal with the requests with due diligence and as fast as we can. And may I add, yes, one thing that's most interesting is the first time I see these Peruvian objects that were given in exchange. And for us as a museum, as museum workers, the one thing that would be really interesting is to know actually what motivated this exchange. Why on earth did this museum in Australia request or decide to exchange those carved trees for pre-Columbian material? And that brings up other issues for us, because you may know that almost every single item of pre-Columbian origin was illegally exported from the country of origin, because Peru never allowed for export of pre-Columbian materials. We have other issues with this material.
Can I just add something? Brook, I just thought it was just quite beautiful hearing you say the word ancestor. Thank you.
So we have another 10 minutes for questions. We must start on time because next speakers speak from Canada. It's very late for them, but I think we can take questions from the floor.
So we just have one question from the floor here in real life.
Hello and good evening, Auntie Ros, Brian and Kimberley, and thank you so much for those really eloquent and powerful videos. I was just curious to know if how, you know, Kimberley, you mentioned how distressing it is being surrounded by these objects, and does Museums Victoria as an entity recognise that there are people who are imagining that it could take generations to get it back? Like, what is their response? You talk about them actively returning objects over the previous decades. What's the current picture? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. The current picture is that we work as fast as we can, and it certainly will not take a generation to repatriate. It may take a year or a couple of years. I mean, I can't like, yeah, a couple of years, I would say. It comes down to resources at the end of the day. And it's about the collection managers working on that collection and working through the process of repatriation. However, we have a dedicated curator of repatriation for the museum, and that was only advertised about 2 weeks ago, and that's being sort of developed as we speak. So we'll have someone starting within the next few weeks, purely dedicated for the repatriation of cultural material. And then we have an incredible collections team. My director is very positive and very open to the work that we're doing in this space. So it's really exciting. It's a really exciting time to be at the museum because it's a whole new world in terms of the way that we're going to be working with community in the future and in giving back their cultural material, but also, you know, there's this beautiful reciprocal thing like we've been talking about happening where we're actually receiving so much in return in terms of the relationships, and it won't be a whole generation. I can with confidence say that.
A last question from the floor, perhaps. Okay. Yes, there's one there.
We just have one more question.
Yes, thank you so much. I wonder, I think the general idea in Europe is that we are talking about objects that were taken centuries or ages ago in this context, but these trees were actually taken quite recently, if I understand correctly. Do you think there's enough awareness that we might be talking about quite recent histories, actually, in Europe?
Could I maybe just say one thing about that? I mean, the first tree that Marara guulany that I know was taken from Wiradjuri Gamilaroi country is in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and that's dated 18. Well, I've been working with Christopher Moulton there, and we are pretty sure it was the first tree that left New South Wales, Australia, for the 1867 Paris exhibition, and of course these are the most recent, and I know that there is another tree in Basel. But over to the three of you. Just quickly, just to reiterate the question from the audience, Brian, Ani Ros and Kimberley, the question was, this is very recent history for the guulany to be taken compared to 300 or 400 years ago. Of course, Australia was only colonised in 1770, 1788. But for us, it's a very important thing because it's about us continuing our culture. And we can't really continue if we don't have these objects. Would one of you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I think I don't think it matters in terms if it's a recent history or, I mean, Australia has the oldest living continuing culture on the planet. Our cultural materials are the most ancient. So if we want to put it in context of time, or some hierarchy of time or hierarchy of cultural material, I suppose we could say, or no, I suppose what I'm trying to say is no objects or cultural material, regardless when it was taken, still has detrimental effect on communities as well. So I think the concerted effort in policy in Australia's history in the eradication of our culture was quite compact and concentrated. So it was effective in that way. Colonisation of Australia was very violent, very abrupt and quite brutal. The removal of people, the removal of cultural materials was quite intense. So I think that's something to put into context. And I think that's why when we talk about the healing process is really important, because the narrative of the repatriation has really significant healing effect because of that abrupt nature and short history. If we think of the longevity of Indigenous cultures in Australia and the short history of colonisation, its impact is quite substantial. So any repatriation is quite significant.
Wonderful. Mandangu to you all. I'm afraid we've ran out of time now, but I'm so happy to see the three of you, Annie, Ros, Kimberley and Brian. And also thanks to Jessica Neath. I know she's watching, a champion behind the scenes. And of course, thank you, Boris and everybody.
Thank you to all of you, and we are certainly looking forward to this collaboration in the years to come around these modern guulany.